Good to see all of you. Welcome to those who are joining us online. We're glad that you're with us this morning. So this is a picture of Ryan Leaf. Ryan Leaf is a former NFL quarterback, and his big claim to fame in the NFL is that he was the biggest NFL flop or bust of all time. If you look on lists on the internet, who was the biggest flop, his name is atop of that list. Now, he grew up in Montana and had a really strong high school season in Montana. He led his team to a state championship and was recruited to play at Washington State. And at Washington State, he had a really strong resume. In college, he did exceptionally well. His average yards were 330 yards per game. He set a Pac-10 record of throwing the most touchdowns in one season. He became the Pac-10 Player of the Year, led the school to their first ever Pac-10 championship, led his team to the Rose Bowl, and was even a finalist for the Heisman Award. He did incredibly well in college. And so in 1998, he decided to forego his senior year and enter the NFL draft. And there was all this hype about him, in part because he was so big. He was kind of built like a linebacker or a tight end, but yet he had this cannon of an arm. He was wildly athletic and could move and was really mobile. And so people were speculating he might even go number one in the draft. Well, that year he was chosen number two. He was picked by then the San Diego Chargers, and he was signed to the largest rookie contract of all time at that point in the NFL. And after the draft, in his initial press conference, he said, "I'm looking forward to a 15-year career, a couple of trips to the Super Bowl, and then a parade through downtown San Diego to celebrate a Super Bowl win." Now, the evening of the draft, after the draft was over, he got on a private jet. He flew to Las Vegas and spent the night partying it up on the Strip, and then struggled through his media interviews the next day, and that basically set his trajectory for his career. Instead of having a 15-year career with lots of trips to the Super Bowl, he had a 4-year career with 0 trips to the Super Bowl. He was said to be a terrible teammate. He was said to have a really poor work ethic. He was always blaming everybody else on the team for their lack of success, developed a drug problem and a drug habit, bounced around a few teams, and then quietly faded away to be never to be heard from again. And then after retirement, he continued to struggle with drugs. He was in and out of jail, being arrested multiple times, even took an attempt on his own life and just floundered for another decade. Now, what makes his story so stark was that the person who was drafted before him in that season was Peyton Manning. And Peyton Manning had, if anything, the exact opposite sort of career that Ryan Leaf had. And the Ryan Leaf story is all too unfortunate in the NFL. Not so much because of the drugs, the arrests, and all sorts of other off-field issues, but you have these young quarterbacks who come into the league, and there's all this hope and this hype about what they will do. They will be the savior. They will turn the team around. They're going to lead us to the Super Bowl, but then they never amount to anything in the NFL. They become a second or maybe even a third string backup. And the list is really long, like right off the top of my head. I can think of Trey Lance, Carson Wentz, Johnny Manziel, Tim Couch, Marcus Mariota. The list goes on and on. Of all these young guys who think everybody thinks they're going to be a star, and then it amounts to nothing. Now, as we enter into 2025, that same anticipation, that same hope for what a new year can bring can be really palpable during this time of year. I mean, it's a new year. We're going to put the past behind us. Success is on the horizon. We're going to blaze a trail forward. It's going to be a wonderful year. This is our year to do whatever it is we want to do. But then you get a few weeks into the year, and you're like, I'm so ready for 2025 to be over. And it's just getting started, right? Especially if the end of 2024 wasn't that great and you had really high hopes for this year. You think to yourself, once you hit that point of like, yes, a new year, and then like the mess of life creeps back on you and you're like, oh, I just feel stuck. I feel pushed down. I feel like I can't get a break. I feel like life is always going to be this way. But then you come across a story like Sam Darnold, another NFL quarterback, who, when he was drafted in 2018 by the Jets, also had high hopes around him. He was chosen number 3 in the draft that year, coming out of USC. In his first 4 years, he also struggled, threw too many interceptions, had losing records, battled injuries, got traded to a few teams, lost his starting job, ended up on the 49ers sitting behind Brock Purdy, who was Mr. Irrelevant, who was making a name for himself. And then he comes to this year. He signs a 1-year deal with the Vikings, probably intending to be a backup. Their starting quarterback goes down with a season-ending injury, and he gets his chance, and he goes on a tear. I mean, just lighting it up, taking the Vikings, even though we hate the Vikings, to a 14-3 record, taking them to the playoffs, setting all kinds of records for a quarterback with a new team in a first year. It's been incredible to watch him succeed. He had his down-and-out moment, and then somehow he got another chance, and things actually went well for him. He was in the MVP conversation for a while. Some people think he's destined to win the comeback player of the year. And what it reminds us is that even when life feels like it's pushing you down, your story is not over. Your story still has more to be developed and written. But the question is, when it feels like we're in the valley and it feels like we're on the low point, like where do we go for hope that things could actually get better, that things could actually turn around, that there might be more to my story than what I'm experiencing now? Where do we go for that? Well, Psalm 107 gives us the answer to where we go. This is what we read. This is Psalm 107, starting in verse 1. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. Those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Psalm 107 is thought to be a trilogy, the third of a trilogy of Psalms that goes 105, 106, and 107 that basically recount the story of the Israelites through the Old Testament. Psalm 105 and Psalm 106 kind of recount the story from Exodus through Judges, when the Israelites go to Egypt and they're enslaved by Pharaoh, but because of the outstretched arm of the Lord, he redeems them. They go into the wilderness and wander around for a while and ultimately enter in to the promised land. And so these 3 Psalms together highlight the ongoing faithfulness of God in Israel's story. And each of these Psalms start with thanksgiving and praise. We see it in Psalm 107, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. And then the call of each psalm is to remember God's faithfulness and then to tell that story from one generation to the next. Now, one of the unique features of Psalm 107 is that it's organized around 4 poetic vignettes that capture 4 quick stories of people who found themselves in difficult situations, who found themselves in a place of trouble. And it's thought that these 4 stories might represent circumstances that the Israelites would have experienced as they were leaving Egypt and going to the Promised Land. But as you hear these stories read, it's easy to see that these stories also capture experiences that we have today. And it might even be that we can find ourselves in real time in the stories that we see in this psalm. And so what I've decided to do this morning is invite 4 readers who are going to come up front to read through the majority of Psalm 107. Read through these 4 stories so that you can hear them all in hopes that you can see that there is actually a pattern to these psalms. So readers, you can come on up. And what I want you to listen for is 2 things in these stories. It's going to go from verse 4 through verse 32, and my hope is that you will catch the pattern. I'll let you go and put that there. Catch the pattern that's in these stories, but then also see if you resonate with any one of these stories, with experiences you have maybe already had or experiences that you are in right now. And each of these stories gives the answer to where do we go for hope when we are in trouble, longing for something to change. So we're going to start reading again at the beginning. This is Psalm 107, starting in verse 1, and then you'll go to verse 4 when I get there. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south.
Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for men, for he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things.
Some sat in darkness, in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains, because they rebelled against God's commands and despised the plans of the Most High. So he subjugated them to bitter labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he breaks down the gates of bronze and cuts through bars of iron.
Some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy.
Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders.
Thank you, guys. So I'm wondering, again, those two questions. Did you notice the pattern of the psalm? And was there anything about any one of those stories that resonates with you that you could find yourself in those circumstances? Now, the pattern of the psalm starts with each of these four groups being in some sort of trouble. We read in verse 4 through 9 that some were wandering and lost. We read in 10 through 16 that some were prisoners in utter darkness, held captive. We read that some in 17 through 22 were afflicted and sick, and then some in 23 through 32 are in chaos at sea. And I wonder if you find yourself in any of those circumstances. Maybe not the specifics, meaning like maybe you're not actually in chaos at sea, but it feels like life around you is constantly tumultuous. And you're being tossed to and fro, and you don't know how to get footing, and it feels like you're always on unsteady ground. Or maybe you have some sort of affliction that ails you and you constantly find yourself longing to get well and you wonder, how long will I have to live with this? Or as it says in verse 16, 10 through 16, that some sat in utter darkness. And darkness can be heavy and oppressive and maybe feels like life has this cloud and this shadow always looming over you. Or maybe you're wandering, you're adrift, you have no direction in life, and you're thinking to yourself, how do I make sense of one day to the next? I'm wondering if anyone finds themselves in those situations, or at very least can look back on your life and say, yes, there have been times. I can point to that season of my life, and it felt exactly like one of the things that's stated in Psalm 107. Now, what's interesting about the trouble that these people find themselves in is that sometimes the trouble comes their way just because life is hard. Because we live in a fallen world that is broken and things aren't the way we're supposed to be. And sometimes we wake up one morning and we just walk into a day and a season that is full of trouble, hardship, and suffering, and we have done nothing to create it. It's just there. But then there are other times we find ourselves in season of trouble because we are the people who have made the mess we're sitting in because of our own decisions. You see twice in this psalm. It says in verse 10 through 16 that those who were in darkness and imprisoned and in chains were there because they rebelled against God. Perhaps they compromised on their convictions. They said, I would never do that thing over there, but in order to get ahead, they said, well, maybe just this one time. And now they find that it's totally sidelined their life, and they're bound up in something that they can't get out of. You also find the same thing in verse 17 through 22. It says, those who are afflicted and sick were there because of their own iniquities. Some commentators liken this to a modern-day version of addiction. You have this sickness that ails you, but it's because you keep going back to this destructive pattern, this destructive habit, thinking it will bring you lasting satisfaction and joy, but it always leaves you feeling empty, and the only thing you know to do is to go back to that thing, hoping it will finally give you the joy you long for. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations because life is hard and broken and messy and difficult, but other times we find ourselves in a world of trouble because of what we have done. I have a good friend who right now, his life is an absolute mess. His family's being torn apart. He might lose his business. Every time he looks around, it's stress, it's chaos, it's dysfunction. And he would say, I've done this to myself. Because of my decisions, because of my choices, he has the clarity of mind to know that he did it. He kept going back to that same thing over and over. Had chances to turn his life around and put things back together, but kept making the same mistake over and over and over again. And he is saying, I did this to myself. Now, with regard to the pattern of this psalm, what you find next is the thing that really helps highlight the consistency in the pattern from one story to the next, because there is one verse that is almost word for word repeated in each story. It's verse 6, verse 13, verse 19, and verse 28. It says, when they were in this world of trouble, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. At some point, each group of people in this psalm come to this place where they realize, I have no control. There is nothing that I can do to fix the situation that I'm in. I am utterly helpless and hopeless. There is no way I'm going to climb out of this hole on my own. And maybe it is that they even tried. Maybe they even tried to fix their situation, manipulate it to get the end result that they wanted. Maybe if I read this book, hire this coach, go to this conference, make this decision, maybe I can finally get my life back on track. But it is an endless cycle of trying and failing, trying and failing, trying and failing. And they hit the point where they say, there's only one thing I can do, and it's look up and say, Lord, please, without you, I have no hope. And they cried out to the Lord for help. Now, here's what I think is so beautiful about this psalm. Regardless of whether or not the trouble that these people find themselves in is simply because of the hardship of this world and they've done nothing to bring it upon themselves, or they put themselves in this mess because of their own situations, because of their own decisions, and because of their own sin. The Lord responds to them both. The Lord responds to the wayward, rebellious son just as much as he is to the one who experienced hardship, seemingly no fault of their own. God is continually there for them. My friend, who's made a mess of his life, is able to say, even in my mess, I'm finding God to be faithful. I'm suffering through the consequences of my bad decisions, but God is still with me. And undeservingly, wildly sweet to me in this season. Even though my life is characterized by heartache and brokenness and pain, God is still with me. Also this week, I sat with a woman who also was experiencing hardship in life, not to her own doing, but she just walked into it. She just woke up one day and there it was. And my prayer for her this week was, Lord, redeem this. And I don't know how that's going to happen. Her life is probably not going to get put back together. But Lord, somehow bring redemption out of the difficulty, the pain, and the trouble she's in. And so this pattern goes that people find themselves in some measure of trouble. They cry out to the Lord for help, and then the Lord responds, and he delivers them from their circumstances. And not in some generic way, but what you see in each of these four stories in this psalm is that there is a very unique, specific way tied to their circumstances in the ways that the Lord helps and redeems them. You see four specific things that the Lord does in these four stories. And the first is the Lord guides those who are lost. Those who are wandering in the wasteland and lost, he gives them guidance and brings them to a place that they can call their home. And we see repeatedly in the scriptures that the Lord is giving us his Spirit. He's giving us his scriptures. He's giving us his people to bring guidance to those who are in need of help, who are wandering and lost and have no idea where to go. Not only does the Lord guide those who are lost, he also frees those who are bound up. Jesus says in Luke chapter 4, the beginning of his public ministry in Luke's gospel, he says, I have come to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and set the oppressed free. Luke is naming that Jesus' mission is to give freedom to those who are bound up, even those who are binding themselves through their own destructive habits and patterns. And not only does Jesus free those who are bound up, we also see that the Lord in this psalm heals those who are sick. And again, it's a repeated pattern in Jesus' ministry. People come to him, they flock to him, and just by speaking, he makes people well. Some people just touch the hem of his garment, and power goes out from him to heal them. Regularly and repeatedly, we see that Jesus is trying and longing and hoping to make people well if they would just submit and surrender to him. The healing that he offers might take hold in their life. And then lastly, we see the Lord gives peace to those in chaos. And we think of the words of Jesus on his final night with the disciples before he goes to the cross. He says, my peace I give you. My peace I leave with you. He'll also say in that same evening, in this world, you will have trouble. But my peace I give you, and take heart, take courage, for I have overcome the world. You see the Lord doing these four things for these groups of people in Psalm 107. You also see the Lord doing these things for all sorts of other people in the pages of Scripture. And the good news of Psalm 107 is that the Lord still does these things today. He still does these things and offers these things to his people today. And so therefore, the pattern ends with each of these four groups of people. Once they experience the deliverance and the redemption of the Lord, their natural response is to give him thanksgiving and praise. It's the other verse that is repeated over and over in this psalm. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. But Psalm 107, apart from just saying that this is what God does for us, invites us into another response. Invites us into another response in addition to praise and thanksgiving and worship. And it's the response of telling the story of what God has done in your life. Psalm 107, verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Because when God intervenes in your life, when God acts and brings redemption, you have a story to tell. Years ago, I was at home waiting for a contractor to come to our house. We had a home project that we needed some help on, and we hired a bunch of different contractors or called a bunch of different contractors to give us quotes so we could decide who we were going to go with to fix this one thing. And so we set a meeting time for this day, this hour. I'm just sitting in my kitchen waiting for this guy. There's a knock at the door. I go to answer the door, and the contractor who's there that day is standing, looking at the street with his back behind me. When he hears the door open, he pops around and he goes, hey man, dude, bro, what's up? It's a beautiful day. How you doing? And I was like, I'm good. Not as good as you are, but I'm doing all right. I mean, this guy was as happy as the sky is high. And he had like all of this like jittery energy. He was just bouncing around. I was like, what are you doing? Where are we going? What's the job you need done? Let's go take a look at it. So we go to the certain part of the house. It's in the outside of the house. He's like, all right. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go look at this. You go inside. I'm going to get my specs. I'm going to get my numbers. I'm going to come back in. We're going to talk about it. And we're going to have a good day. I'm like, okay. There will not be any coffee served on the inside because clearly you have had your fill. So he does what he needs to do. He comes into my kitchen. We're sitting down at the kitchen table, and he's just doing the salesy thing. He's making small talk. He's talking about this. He's talking about that, telling me how he used to live in the area and what it was like growing up there. And then he turns the conversation on me, and he asks what I do for a living. And I go, oh, I'm a pastor. And he goes, shoot. Easiest way to kill a conversation if you're a pastor is tell somebody you're a pastor. And he goes, shoot. And it just like, it lingers, like almost like he's been busted, if he's been caught doing something. And then he leans into the table and he's like, hey, I got something for you. Almost like we're trying to do a weird sort of shady drug deal in the middle of this conversation. And he opens up his coat pocket, he pulls out his wallet, he opens up his wallet, and he puts this card on the table and he slides it across. And he says, look at that right there. So I pull it close to me, and it's a license. And it's his license. His name was Frank. Frank was on the license. But the picture of Frank on the license looked terrible. And if you looked at the date of it, it was from years ago. And I'm like, Frank, is this you? He's like, yep, that was me. And it's like, Frank, what in the world happened to you? And then he proceeded to tell me this story of the way his life used to be. He told me this story of this bar that was actually right around the corner from where I lived. He's like, it was amazing. It had this like rotating bar, like you would drink and the bar would spin around and it would just go everywhere. And I used to live there. It was the place where I would go with my buddy all the time. But we were drinking ourselves into an early grave. He said, my business partner and I were blowing up our lives, burning the candle on both ends and then going out and partying all night and just running our business into the ground. I was never home for my wife. I was never home for my kids. She eventually kicked me out of the house. I was sleeping in the office, but we were going to lose our business, and I had no idea if I'd even have a place to sleep at my work. It was like my car was on fire and I was driving off a cliff. That's the way my life felt. And I was like, well, what happened? I said, well, I hit rock bottom. I had nothing left. And I was talking to a friend one day, and he invited me to church. And I had nothing else going on. I had nothing else to lose. And so I said yes. And I was sitting in the back corner of the church because I didn't want to go up front. And as the preacher got up to talk that day, it was like everyone else in the room disappeared. and it was just he and I. And everything he said hit me right between the eye and pierced my heart. And in that moment, the only thing I could think to do was cry out to the Lord for help. My life is a mess. I am in a world of trouble. It's all due to my own making, and I need a way out. And the Lord answered my cry that day. And I keep that license as a reminder of the way that God changed my life. He says in the following weeks, he started to have communication again with his wife. He was able to move back in. He started bringing his family to church, and one day the pastor starts talking about baptism and what means. And 2 weeks later, he and his whole family got baptized together. He has an incredible story to tell. When God intervenes in your life, you have a story to tell. And here's what we believe. At the core of our being as a church, we believe that everybody in this room has a story to tell. Everybody in this room who has had an encounter with God, who has said yes to Jesus, who has surrendered their life, has a story to tell. And what we are doing today is we are launching a new vision initiative that we are calling Storytellers. Because as we look back on where our church has been, the last 2 years of our church has been about this building renovation project that we just finished, which was all well and good because we needed to do that in order to help our church become the church and right-size our building to help our church become the church that we felt like God was calling us to be. But back in March of this year, myself, along with the staff, started asking the so what, now what question. Meaning there will come a day when we're on the other side of this building project. And then what are we going to do? Like, what's life for our church going to be about at that moment in time? And so over the course of the spring, I had conversation after conversation, worked through things, prayed through things, saying, what is the nature of our church? What is the makeup of our church? And we're hoping this vision initiative isn't a new program. It isn't just a sermon series, but it helps clarify, refine, and solidify the DNA of our church. And when you look to the mission statement of our church, so much of it is right there because we read that Meadowbrook Church exists to invite people to discover Jesus and become his fully devoted follower who influences the world. And we believe the best tool that you have to invite people to discover Jesus and influence the community around you is the story of what God has done and is doing in your life. Because our core conviction is that God's not done writing your story. No matter where you've been this last year, no matter what it feels like 2025 is off to, like if it's good, bad, or indifferent, we believe that God is not done writing your story. And if we are called to be people who invite people to discover Jesus, your story is the best tool that you have. And we believe that the world needs to hear your story. And so as we work through this sermon series, we are starting this series to not just be an 8-week thing, but to be a thing that spans over the course of years. We're asking the starting point for you to be these 3 questions. Those 3 questions are 1, what is my unique story? 2, how is God in the process of redeeming my story? And then 3, with whom should I tell my story? Because again, you have a story to tell. Just like it says in Psalm 107, verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. We believe that you have a story to tell. And so as we launch this initiative, we want to put one thing in your hands today that we hope will help you understand and capture your story. Not just a story of what's happened in your life, but the story of what God is doing in real time. When you leave today, there will be people in the lobby by each door up here and down below passing out journals that we are hoping will become a record for you of what God has done and is doing in your life. You'll find that on the inside covers and flaps, there's some extra things to think through and understand about this initiative. But inside, the thing we want to highlight today is there's something called a little field guide. It captures the vision and trajectory of this initiative And so we'd ask for you to take this journal, flip through this field guide. On the back of this field guide, there's all sorts of other resources. There's a couple QR codes. You can go to our website. If you go to our homepage, you'll find that there is a Storytellers tab on the top. Click on that. It will take you to a Storytellers page, and there's all these digital resources there, hoping to help you pay attention to what God is doing in your life and participate. Because our other conviction is that God is always present. He's always at work. He's always doing new things. He's always calling you and inviting you into a new work. The question is, are we going to participate in it or not? So what we want you to do with this journal is bring it back next week. If you're a note taker, take notes from the sermon series in this journal, but also start to record maybe things from your past that you've been able to notice of what God has done in your life. And maybe even in real time what He's doing today. We're going to talk more about how you can use this journal to capture the record of what God's doing in your life. But when you think of what the Scriptures are, it's the story of God being faithful to His people from one generation to the next. We want to invite you into capturing your own story of how God has been and is faithful to you so that you can go out into the world and tell the story of God's faithfulness in your life, trusting that He will bring other people into His family because of the story He is writing in and through you. And so we believe that this is not, again, a sermon series. It's not a program. It's not just a class that we're going to offer. But we're hoping this is an initiative that spans over the course of years, that clarifies and solidifies who we are as a church, to be a community of kingdom storytellers who invite people to discover Jesus, become His fully devoted follower, and then with their own story, go out and influence the world. So may you know that God is not done writing your own story. May you see that He is always present and at work in your life. May you have eyes to see and ears to hear where and how He's inviting you to participate with Him. And may you develop the courage to tell your story to a world that needs to hear it. Lord, we thank You so much for who You are. We thank You so much for all the ways that You have been faithful in our lives. Lord, sometimes we think that the story of what You're doing comes in these big, miraculous ways. And Lord, I pray that You would give us eyes to see it in the mundane, in the simple, everyday moments of life. That we would be able to find where You're at work. That we would operate as a divine detective and participate and partner with You. Lord, that we would be able to identify where and how You are continually refining and redeeming us one day at a time. And so, Lord, we open our life to You. We say we are Yours. And if we walked in today feeling like life is a mess and that we're in a world of trouble, I pray, Lord, that we would cry out to You, that we would prepare our hearts to be delivered, and that we would go into the world with thanksgiving and praise on our lips and tell the story of Your goodness and faithfulness in our lives. Amen.